Alright, so this is the first video about Java array lists. Now there are some differences between array lists and arrays. First and foremost, they are two totally different classes in the Java API in the library. Arrays, as we probably already know, are set in stone once you created them. You declare an array, you declare what type it is, and then you declare at some point how many elements are in that array, and then that cannot shrink nor can it grow, at least not without a lot of very creative programming, which would include creating other arrays, and we'll just skip that conversation. But ArrayList, on the other hand, allow you to create it. It has no particular size at the point, and it can grow and it can shrink all the way from 0 elements to conceivably an endless amount. So arrays are good in some certain circumstances. If you know you're only going to hold so many objects of something, then it's a great thing to use. It's easy, it's straightforward, it's not too memory intensive. So one way you might use an array is if you knew you were only going to have 6 people in a particular group. Then yeah, you should probably just create an array of 6 objects to hold the information on those people. However, an array list is different because an array list allows things to shrink and grow. So a really good example of an array list might be the amount of people who are your friends on social media. When you first created your account, you didn't have any. Then you might have gotten 1, 2, or all the way to 600, and sometimes you post something that hurts people's feelings or whatever they disagree with, and now instead of those 600 friends, you're back down to 530, and then so forth and so on. So you can see an array list might be more appropriate in some situations because an array list grows, shrinks, expands as needed. So both are found in the java.util package, so we can see that on that bottom one there. Declaring an array list is a little bit different than declaring arrays as well. Now, one thing to note is if you were really programming an actual program, which we will briefly, you would have to have the import statement. And right here we can see that it's a native class in the Java library. It's found in the util package, and its name, not surprisingly, is ArrayList. So that's the import statement. Now, if you were looking at this particular video because you're preparing for the AP exam for Java, then you know, at least I hope you know, you don't actually have to remember to import. All imports are just assumed that they're already made. Moving on, we've got 2 different lines of code here after that import. We have ArrayList raw is assigned a new array list, empty parameters, so we're calling the constructor to construct an array list there. There are some problems with that. One is that because I don't know what data type, and when I say I'm thinking I'm the Java compiler, I don't know what data type you're dealing with, so it's hard for me to tell you whether or not you have some errors or issues before you actually run the code. So one of the problems of doing that is you might end up having errors in your code that will be more difficult to figure out. This last line in here, array list, let's go with data type strings, let's call it or name it generic, and let's assign it a new array list of string objects constructor. This will help the compiler see if there are any errors before you actually run and compile the code. That is the preferred method of declaring and assigning a new array list object. So some things to note when we talk about comparing arrays to array list, there's no initial length in the array list. All right, so in an array we know, hey, there's going to be 5 elements, here you go, or we're going to put a list in there of elements, so there's 6 elements. We know that it's going to be a 6-element array, that's it. And then we could run, let's say we create an array called students or second hour. We could say second hour dot length, and it would tell us how many objects or how many elements possible in that array. ArrayList are differently. We actually call a method called size. So length is for arrays, size is for ArrayList. That's one of the most confusing things at first. And it's actually a trick. Again, if you're preparing for the AP exam, don't be surprised if you see something like that where they're trying to trick you with running length on an array list or running size on an array. They're actually the other way around. So we'll move on to the next thing here. So some things you should know is that an ArrayList object is mutable and contains object references. So unlike arrays where we can keep primitive data like ints and doubles and chars, when we actually keep ints, doubles, and chars inside of an ArrayList, they become what's called their wrapper classes. So there is an integer class in Java that starts with capital I. Your lowercase int, your primitive data, if you were to create an ArrayList, it automatically or auto boxes it into an object type, the integer class. And I know that might seem a little bit confusing at first. Just kind of accept it. If you create a char, then that char actually turns into or auto boxes into a character object, and you can find that in the Java library as well. And your doubles, your lowercase doubles, if you keep that in an array list, it actually auto boxes that up to your capital D double class. So that's kind of what that means, that first one. You can create, and you already saw this in that last slide, array list just by having empty parameters and not suggesting what kind. You can create an array list being very specific of what type of data there is in there. And you can also use the methods of those classes. So like if we had a string array list, we can also use those methods on those objects inside of that array list. And that's very much like arrays. We've kind of seen that before. And then this last one, kind of what I said at the end of the last slide, it's really preferred that you use that format where you say you're going to have an array list of these type of objects. And the reason why is because it allows the compiler to find errors that would otherwise be found only when you're running the program. So then your program could potentially crash, and then you'd have to problem solve that. So it's typically preferred that you do the declarations with the types in them. So traversing array lists, believe it or not, isn't a whole lot different in most cases than traversing an array. But there is an exception. And most notably, going down here, now you should read these and go over these, but those I think you'll see are pretty much just like arrays. But down here is where you start to get a little bit different. You really start to divert from the array information, because you can insert and delete inside of an array list. So if I start to sort through an array list and somehow or another I add more objects to that array list, this will still potentially traverse through it, or I might run into errors. I might not show them. So that's one tricky thing about traversing through array lists, and something we'll have to learn how to control or be very aware of, is how do you traverse through that array knowing that we could potentially delete and add objects while we're doing this. So that's something we'll kind of take a look at, but there are a lot of ways to kind of handle that potential issue. So using array list methods, we're going to learn how to do that, and we're actually going to program a code, create a program. I actually have a link to some of the code that we're going to start off with in the description of this video, so you'll be able to find that really easy, and you can throw it into a replit is what I'm doing, or whatever IDE you're using, and we can kind of practice some of these things out. Now, like I said, there are methods for examining an array list. We can check its size. Again, don't get confused. Arrays, we check its length. Array list, we check its size. And then testing it, whether it's empty or how many items it has. We can insert, we can remove. We can do a lot of things to these objects. So we're going to take a look at these. Now, I would suggest writing these down, because we're going to actually use quite a few of these, or at least examine quite a few of these in the code that follows. Alright, so here we have the code example. Like I said, the link to this, if you don't have this code, is in the description of this video. But if we take a look at this, here's the import statement. Again, if you're practicing for the AP exam, you do not have to put in imports. They're already assumed. However, if you're real life coding, definitely need that import there. Now this class named main has a main method, and inside the main method we start off with just a typical hello world, and then we create an array list. We declare an array list of string objects, and we refer to it as list. And we use the new keyword denoting that we're about to invoke the constructor for the ArrayList class. And again, the object type's a string, and then we call the parameters for the constructor, which are no parameters. And then you'll see that we're using the method add. So for the object list, which is the array list, we're going to add 1, add 2, add 3, add 4, add 5. Now you'll notice that all of these are strings, and then we use a for loop, much like we would use for a typical array, and we say for the integer I, which is assigned the value 0, as long as I is less than the size of list. Again, note that that's the difference. If we look back to any of the array stuff that you might have done in the past, you'll see that if this were an array named list, we would say list.length, and that would be it. But because this is an array list, we actually invoke the size method, which returns how big is the size of this particular array. And it will tell us that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elements in this. This would be 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, so those 5 elements. And then I++. So it'll iterate through, and each time it does, it will print out the object found at the index I. You'll also notice the get method. So if we go back to this, we can see what's going on. So size returns the number of size of elements in the list, and add, what we're doing is we add the object to the end of the list. So that very first one that said 1, well, there was nothing in the list, so that goes to the very first element. And then when we said 2, well, 1 was there, so we added 2 right after 1, so forth and so on. So it adds to the end. Now you'll see that there is another add method, and this has an overriding. We'll take a look at how to use that in just a couple seconds. And then we have get, which returns the element at the index, which is what we're using. So if we go back to that code, you can see that we're getting the element at that particular one. So this should print out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, hello world, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But there's a little bit more. I added another array list down here. Again, I'm keeping with string objects just to try to avoid too much confusion at first. So I have an array list of string objects. This one I'm referring to as animals, so the name of this array list is animals. And I am invoking the new keyword, which means I am going to use the constructor for ArrayList. Again, I'm saying that I have string objects, and there's me with the parameters. Now, I can refer to that array list, animals, and I can add dog. Then I can add, so at the very first element, index 0 is dog. I then add cat. I then add snake. And then you're going to see something a little bit different here. Set, I've got a number, comma, a string. Set, I have a number, a comma, a string, and I have remove as well. Let's take a look at those real quick. So set replaces the element at position index, so whatever index is, with object, so whatever object is. So when we take a look back at that code, index is 2, and the object is the string known as lizard. So here's what happens. In index 0 is dog, index 1 is cat, and index 2 is snake. So I have 3 objects in my array list. But then I say, hey, at index 2, which is, this is 0, this is 1, this is 2, put lizard. So what happens is 0, 1, 2 now becomes 0, 1, remove this, 2. So in this, I would have dog, cat, lizard at this point. And then I set one fish, so 0, 1. So now I replace cat with fish. So now if I were to print this out at this point, it would read dog, fish, lizard. Then I remove 2, which would be removing lizard, and then I print out animals, which would be dog and fish. I'll go ahead and run this and we can kind of take a look at it real quick. And we can see how this whole code runs. Again, it will start off with hello world, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because we just iterated through it from start to end. And then you'll see that the last thing it prints out is dog, fish, because of all this. Now, if this is confusing to you, again, I would take a look at this, really read through it. And something that might be helpful to you is if you copy and paste this printout for all the elements and animals, you could do something like this. After each line, we could print out what's going on in there. All right, so now I'm printing out at each line, and if I run this again, I'm going to focus just on this particular portion of the code here. You'll see that the very first line, after I add dog to the array list, I can print out animals, and it reads just dog. Then I added another element, cat. I print it out, I get dog, cat. Add another element, snake. I print it out, I get dog, cat, snake. I set at index 2 lizard, so snake goes away because that was index 2, dog, cat, lizard. And so forth and so on. You can see how it ends up creating dog, fish. So that is your first introduction to it. What I would suggest is I would look back at this and I would try to invoke some of these methods and try to control the output of an array list, as well as how to iterate through it. Maybe go backwards and instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe print out 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Those types of exercises will get you to be a little bit more familiar and a little bit better with array lists.